I want to talk about masks and why I think they're a bad idea. In the first place, I think that they are inherently dehumanizing. Covering up your face is essentially covering up your individuality as a human being. That would be enough on its own for me to oppose masks, but I think we can go deeper into why they're a bad idea. I want to suggest that the government has imposed them at this stage in order to correct their previous mistakes. And so this second mistake is a solution to the first mistake, a mistake correcting a mistake, kind of like papering over or a band-aid solution, that sort of idea. I used to live in an old house on a really old street, and all the houses were built at the same time, and they all had a serious damp problem. Whenever a tenant would move out and a new tenant would come in, the landlord would not do anything about the damp except paint over it. And once it was painted over, you couldn't see it, and it looked like there was no problem. But of course, within a few weeks or months, it would come back. That's the sort of thing that the government's done. Rather than go back to the source of the problem, try to undo your errors, and get back to a place of truth, integrity, and stability, they've just tried to fix it with another mistake. And that's a huge mistake itself, to think like that. But it's something that human beings are prone to. So, what was their first mistake? The government's first mistake was the lockdown itself. Now, the peak of deaths in England and Wales was the 8th of April. That's pretty well known by now. And the average time from infection to death is 23 days. That puts the peak of infections about 5 days before the lockdown happened. And what does that mean? It means the lockdown didn't do what it was supposed to do. Remember, the original justification for lockdown was to flatten the curve, to delay transmission of the virus, to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed. It wasn't to eradicate the virus. It wasn't to directly to save everybody, although indirectly they would argue it was. It was to save the NHS. And that was a political decision made by a conservative government for whom the NHS has always been a weak spot. This was their opportunity to show they were the party of the NHS. So they locked us down. They told all the healthy population to stay in their homes, something unprecedented, restricted ancient liberties, something that wasn't even done to this extent in wartime. Took away our right to freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and even took away our freedoms to visit our own family members. Once they made that mistake, which of course has caused tremendous, irreparable damage to the economy, they couldn't go back. They couldn't admit they made a mistake. So if they weren't prepared to do that, what was left to them except to prove after the fact that it was the right thing to do, which requires making the coronavirus look as dangerous as possible and trying to attribute any improvement to their own actions. And since then, they've been doing just that. It's pretty well known that the number of deaths, somewhere around 45,000 at the moment, is overstated, that they're counting any death that happened up to 3 months after a positive test as a coronavirus death. Which means, and wherever I read this, I don't remember now, even if someone was hit by a bus 3 months after a positive coronavirus test, that's counted as a coronavirus death. Okay, well, you can see what the government's doing. They're trying to make it look as bad as possible to justify the lockdown that they did. Well, now what? The economy is in such a terrible shape, and they need people to get back to work. How can they do that? All the fear-mongering has made people too afraid to go back to work, too afraid to go to the shops, to go to the pubs, to kickstart the economy and get things back to normal. Well, this is where the masks come in. The masks are a secondary mistake to quote-unquote fix the first mistake. With masks, people will feel safe enough, the government hopes, to go back to work, to go back to the bars and restaurants and get the economy going. But at the same time, masks are a constant reminder of the danger. So the government's found this perfect solution, it thinks, that will allow people to remain afraid, justify the government's previous actions, and also solve this terrible economic result, which is just going to get worse and worse. Basically, it allows the government not to admit its mistakes. And we can see this sort of thing in other areas. Just think of a drug addict. First mistake is getting involved with drugs in the first place. People do that for a variety of reasons. But once you're a drug user, in order to maintain what feels to you like a livable state of being, you have to keep using. Alcohol works the same way. Alcoholics become that way for a variety of reasons. Something's gone wrong in their lives, perhaps. And then once they're used to having alcohol in their system, once alcohol leaves their system, they feel so terrible, they'll say something like, "I need a drink." And thus, in both cases, they're continuing to live in this unstable manner, and it can't last forever. Another example, which was brought to my attention by Carbon Mike, and if you haven't listened to Carbon Mike's podcasts, I can't endorse them enough, in which he spoke about the Boeing 737 MAX, which had crashes in which hundreds of people died last year, the year before. And in designing that aircraft, the engine was so large that they had to move it from wherever the usual place on a plane an engine would be. And their reasons for this were, it was a bigger engine, they had made a plane that they wanted to be more efficient, whatever. Their reasons may have been good, but such reasons can never supersede the primary purpose in designing a plane, which is that you're sending a metal tube 35,000 feet in the air, and it needs not to crash. And so by moving the engine, it made the aircraft less stable. Now, I'm not sure that it made the aircraft inherently unstable, but it changed it ever so slightly that it was enough to change how the pilots felt when they flew. And that's why, in order to correct that little alteration that moving the engine caused, they used a software. And the software was meant as a corrective. So because of that situation, when the software malfunctioned, the result was the plane crashed. Now, another example, going back to the idea of drugs, Jordan Peterson's recent experience with benzodiazepines. He started taking one drug for depression, and then once it caused him serious problems, I believe when his daughter originally wrote about this, they said that all the doctors in the hospitals in North America just wanted to give him more drugs to fix the problems that were caused by the first drugs. When, of course, the right thing to do is to try and get off the drugs entirely, get back to a position of stability. And that's what we need to do in everything. You can start to see this pattern of one mistake trying to fix another mistake almost everywhere you look in society. So, say a man is unfaithful to his wife. Say it only happened once. His solution, in order to get back to living what he thinks is a normal life, is not to say anything, to lie to his wife, and he'll tell himself things like, well, it would hurt her unnecessarily, and it's just better off that she doesn't know, and as time goes on, he forgets about it. But of course, then he's living in a dishonest marriage, which is now built on a lie. Now, I think this goes actually much deeper than just a band-aid solution or a mistake to correct a mistake. We can go deeper. We can go to the words of Christ when he said, Satan drives out Satan. I believe this is the Gospel of Matthew. Here it is. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about one mistake, one deviation from stability, one deviation from truth, charity, goodness. And the only real solution to that is to go back to stability, back to goodness, back to truth. But too often people want to take the easy way out, find some other solution, which isn't really a solution, but it might appear to be. It allows them to sort of limp along in some way. And so they make a second mistake and treat that as the solution. So the first deviation is satanic, and the proposed solution, the second mistake, is satanic. Satan driving out Satan. And a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Eventually, the plane crashes. Eventually, the alcoholic or the drug addict destroys the lives of people around them, their own lives, their relationships, their job. Eventually, they die. This is a bad idea. And our government is currently doing exactly this. This idea of masks. Now, the dehumanizing element, I actually think is worth thinking about as well. We are individuals, individual human beings. We communicate through our faces, and we need to look at each other when we talk. Now, the fact that the world is going more and more online and people are communicating via text message and social media more and more, to me, that's not an explanation. I recently wrote to my member of parliament about this, and she responded by saying she was astonished that I could make the argument about communication by faces because we don't do that anymore anyway. Well, I regard that as a negative thing, and I regard any increase in that as a negative thing, but particularly the fact that the government is forcing us to do it. That is the worst part. But the interesting symbolism of being compelled to cover our faces, it makes you suspect that there's an evil conspiracy to deny individuality and force the people to become pawns of the state. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's what the government's doing. But I do think that when they make shallow policy for political expediency to fix a mistake like this, it necessarily dehumanizes us because its goal is not to treat people as individuals. Governments cannot help people on an individual basis. That happens from other individuals, from the family, from the community, from friends. It can't happen at the very top of society, all the way down. If the government, the Prime Minister, the President, whoever, is deemed the one person who can help you, all he can do is turn you into a pawn along with millions of other people. In some parts of the world, people are treated as pawns of the state. China, for example. And in China, people have been wearing masks for years. Is there a connection there? I certainly think so. The idea of subsidiarity, which is a Catholic idea, I can't remember which pope it was who wrote about it, but that's where the answer is. The answer is things in society, issues need to be dealt with at the lowest possible level. It can't be a national government solving all your personal problems. It's not even possible because there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the problems in society. Rather, only by coming together as a community can you solve problems at the community level. And then if the problem gets too big for the community, you might have to go up higher to the local council or city. And then if the problem's too big for that, then you go up higher. Once you get to the national level, that becomes a problem that it is appropriate for the government, the national government, to deal with. Now, there's another element here of wearing masks and denying individuality, what's left over? Once you've covered up your face, once people look at you and they see not you as an individual, what do they see? Well, one thing that's left over is the color of your skin. If everyone's walking around in a mask, you might not be able to see who they are individually, but you can definitely tell whether they're white or black. Now, given everything else that's going on in society, with all the Black Lives Matter protests and the racial tension, anything that highlights the color of a person's skin and minimizes their individuality is going to be a bad thing. So an unintended consequence of this is that it's going to highlight group identity more and create greater collective conflict in our society. At some point, this kingdom divided against itself will not be able to stand. The government makes a mistake, takes away individual liberty. Its solution is a further mistake, further denying individual liberty and enhancing group identity. And at the same time, there's a collectivist movement which is promoting exactly that. How can a democracy built on individual liberty and individual sovereignty stand? Rene Girard, the French philosopher, anthropologist, literary theorist, he spoke about this idea throughout his career in his theories on the origin of culture and religion. Mankind is violent. That's the first problem. What was mankind's solution to that violence? Well, to gang up and channel all the hostility onto one person, one victim, a scapegoat. You see, all the violence, according to Girard, was based on mimetic rivalry. What makes mankind different from animals, one of the things anyway, is that man copies his desires from other people. And when desire is copied, and he called it mimetic desire, then two people want the same thing. They become rivals, and they fight. So the solution was eventually this hostility and this violence, which would have been chaotic, was organized into an entire community, and that hostility was put all onto this one scapegoat. And the result was peace. Satan drove out Satan, and culture was born. And that turned into a religion, because once they realized that through this act of collective murder, we attained peace, there must have been something sacred about that moment. So this community would reenact that periodically, reenact the sacrifice another person, or eventually an animal, or just act it out in some way. And the flip side would be there would be a set of prohibitions to prevent the chaotic violence from coming back. And Girard argued that throughout history, all primitive religions came about this way. And it would be the victim of that first act of violence that eventually became deified, became the deity. Now, this is so deep in every culture, it is the way cultures work. Satan driving out Satan, that he argued what Christianity did was turn this inside out, because Christ came to disrupt this whole mechanism. To say that you cannot solve violence with a further act of violence. The peace you get isn't real peace. And unlike other religions, which take the perspective of the mob against the scapegoat, Christianity takes the perspective of the victim. Christ himself became the victim. And in doing so, he exposed this mechanism. He exposed Satan driving out Satan. He exposed this Band-Aid solution, this unstable way of being. And Christianity calls for everyone not to fix your problems by these other mistakes, but to go back to the center, back to stability, back to truth, back to charity. It's the only real possibility. And all Christianity is that. Just take the Catholic sacrament of confession. Many Catholics misuse or misunderstand this sacrament. Certainly non-Catholics may take it this way, that it doesn't matter what you do because you can just go to confession. But then you're almost treating the confessional as that sort of Band-Aid solution. You're constantly deviating from that place of truth and charity, and then you're just fixing it. That's not what confession is for. That's not what anything the church does is for. What the church does is tries to help you come back to the center, to admit your wrongs and work your way back. And that's precisely what this government needs to do. It's what we all need to do. Whenever you tell a lie, make a mistake, it's so easy to just tell another lie or do something else to cover up what you've done that takes you further away from that place of stability, that place of truth. But the only real solution is to work your way back. And it's very difficult. You have to be humble. You have to admit you did something wrong. And you have to work hard to rebuild yourself, to get down to the bottom of the issue, not to paper over it. Get down to the bottom. If something went wrong, go back, fix it, and build from there. Otherwise, the foundations of whatever it is you're accomplishing, if it's the life you're living or the way a government is governing a country, there will be something wrong and it will not be able to stand and it will come crashing down. My hope is that this government will acknowledge that it made a mistake. Now, it looks like they panicked. It looks like they were hysterical. There was tremendous pressure on them from within the country, from the press, from other countries. In many ways, it's understandable. But this is what they're there for. This is what they're paid for. To make wise decisions, prioritizing different factors. And from the look of it, they didn't do that. They just went ahead with this bad idea. And now they've responded to it with another bad idea. So what's next? Well, if they keep going down this road, they're going to have to make another mistake. Because once the consequences of the mistakes they've made so far become apparent, they're going to have to find a way to paper over it. I really hope that people start waking up to this. There are some great journalists out there and other public figures who are awake to it. Peter Hitchens is probably the best example. Toby Young has his Lockdown Skeptics. That's a great resource. James Dellingpole, Hector Drummond, former Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption has been great during this whole lockdown. Maybe you don't share the politics of some of those journalists I mentioned, but Jonathan Sumption ought to have the respect of everyone in this country. Masks are a bad idea, and the evidence doesn't even show that they do anything. What are the chances that everyone out there wearing some cloth on their face throws it out or washes it after every use? Because that's what you'd have to do to keep it even remotely hygienic. Otherwise, you're putting this thing on your face that's covered in saliva and you're breathing on it, you're coughing on it, you're sneezing in it, and then next time you go to the store, you put it back on. And you touched it. And then you're touching things in the store. This isn't for our health. This isn't to prevent the virus spreading. This is to make us conform, to remind us that there's danger out there, and to make us feel safe enough to go back to work. And the government needs to be called out on it, because it's not going to end well. Thanks for listening.